The alien world was on fire, the night sky red and black with smoke, towers broken like teeth, streets full of dust and glass, families running with bundles pressed to their chests while the ground shook under distant impacts. And no one could remember the last quiet hour, because quiet had turned into fear, and fear had become the air they breathed. The invaders had arrived 2 weeks earlier, sliding into orbit like a dark lid placed over a candle, cutting off every line of escape, jamming radios, burning defense stations, and shattering the small fleet that tried to rise from the planet's surface. It was fast, it was cruel, and it was done before most people even understood what was happening. Now whole districts were empty, markets cold, schools silent, and the wind carried the smell of melted metal and old smoke. Soldiers who had once joked on checkpoints now stood without words, dust on their faces, eyes bright with exhaustion, listening to the sky the way farmers listen to thunder, waiting for the next strike to fall, the one that might end everything. Mothers told stories in the cracks of basements to keep children calm, but their voices shook, and when the little ones asked if the ships would leave soon, the mothers could not answer. They pressed their lips together and hugged them tighter, because lies were heavy and truth was worse. Above the planet, the enemy cruisers glowed and drifted like patient sharks, and each time a defense gun tried to fire, a sudden spear of light reached down and turned it into a flower of sparks. The cities were dying, and no one knew how to stop it. Inside the great council hall, which had once been a museum with bright mosaics and high windows, the leaders argued under blackout lamps, the walls covered with maps and smoke-stained drapes. One shouted that surrender would save lives, that a bad peace was better than a noble grave. Another slammed the table and said surrender was only a slower death, because those ships were not builders, they were eaters, and eaters did not stop when the plate was empty. They looked up at the hand that held it. A third leader, with white hair and a voice like rust, said there was only one chance left, the old signal system deep below the hall, the one that had never been used, the one built by cautious minds who knew history turns like a blade. He said they should send a cry into the dark, not to the near allies, not to the friendly ports, because those friends had already turned away in fear. He said they should send it farther, past known charts, past the safe roads between stars, and hope that someone stronger than the invaders would hear. The chamber went quiet at that word stronger, because strength had become a complicated thing. They all knew the stories of the ones who lived beyond the safe maps, the ones born on a world that pushed back against life every hour of the day. They had many names in old songs, but the one the soldiers whispered now was simple and heavy: Deathworlders. Some called them heroes, some called them monsters, and most people called them both. The oldest leader lifted his hand and said they had no fleet, they had no shields, but they still had a voice, and sometimes a voice can move a mountain if it travels far enough. Then he asked the room to vote, and the vote was not clean, the vote was not brave, but it was enough, and the lawbinders signed the order with burned fingers. Beneath the hall, down narrow stairs where oil lamps smoked and wires slept like roots, technicians gathered around a machine that had not sung for 100 years. It was a ring of crystal and copper rib, set in a cradle of stone, carved with marks from a war long gone, and when they brushed the layers of dust away, it woke like an old animal, lights flickering along its ribs, a deep hum filling the chamber, not loud, but full, like a hand pressed against the chest of a giant, the youngest. Tech kept wiping his palms on his tunic, whispering questions that had no answers. Who would hear them? What would come? Would it be better than what was already here? The chief engineer, a quiet woman with burn scars across her cheek, checked the calibration with steady fingers and said the only true thing. The universe was wide, and in wide places, sometimes help came from angles no one expected. They linked the city grid. They linked the old relays on the mountain ridge, and the ring drank power like a thirsty throat. The needles climbed, the air crackled, and beside the door a small praying mat lay where a guard had set it. Because even guards wanted the machine to choose mercy. The engineer counted down, and every pair of eyes in the room counted with her. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, send. The signal lifted through the stone like heat and rode the antenna on the ridge, and the ridge slipped it into the cold air above the clouds, and the clouds let it pass because this was a message made of will, not water. A narrow beam with a throat of thunder and a skin of old math. It cut between the enemy scanners like a blue fish in dark grass and sprang outward along lines that were not lines at all, just agreements between stars written in numbers. As it flew, it carried everything that mattered: coordinates, distress markers, the brand of the invaders, the percentage of the cities still standing, the locations of hospitals and vaults, and underneath those numbers, beneath the bone of the message, there was a voice, not a language voice, but a feeling voice, the simple raw plea that every child knows, please help. It was the taste of smoke, the bite of fear, the thin thread of hope that still glows when wind has nearly blown the flame away. The enemy had blocked most bands. They had filled the local space with jamming like a net of iron. But this signal slipped through gaps the net's makers had forgotten. Old harmonics from old wars. A door left cracked by pride. And the beam ran. It ran across the dark like a thrown spear. While it ran, the city waited. Waiting had become the hardest work. The baker who once rose early to make bread now rose to carry water to the infirmary. The teacher who once taught music now sorted bandages and told breathing stories to the wounded. The street kids who once chased whistles in the market now moved messages through tunnels. The soldier who once thought courage meant stepping forward now stood at a shelter door and learned that courage sometimes meant staying still. Down in the basement of a library, a mother drew roads on the floor with chalk so her son could drive a broken toy along them. She said the roads would be real again soon. He asked when soon was. She said soon is the next sunrise. He asked how many sunrises they had left. She looked at the chalk and said as many as we can carry. Outside, the air tasted like old iron. The enemy ships made slow orbits as if boredom had made them crueler, and every hour a long thin weapon reached down and erased a new shape. On the ground, people did not go to the windows. They knew the shape might be a house they loved. The council sent runners to the districts with a single message: stay below, stay calm, share water, do not use long-range transmissions. If anyone hears a voice that is not the invaders, report it to the hall. The runners moved like shadows, and once in a while a runner did not come back. Sometimes a wall fell, sometimes a light found a back, and the line of runners simply closed around the gap and kept going. In the watchtower by the river, an old radar set blinked with an uneven heartbeat. The watchman patted it like an old dog and asked it to hold on a little longer. On the roof of the hospital a nurse stood with a strip of light cloth tied to a pole, not to call for rescue, but to give her own eyes somewhere to rest that was not blood. Somewhere soft that moved to wind's orders, not to wars. By the eastern gate a squad dug a shallow trench as if a trench could stand against fire from the sky. They dug anyway. Because hands like to make shapes that mean I am here. I will not go. The signal ran on, past the local way stations, past the bright trade lines where fat ships carried sugar rock and singing birds, past the mining knots where men in cold suits cut ice with patient blades. It crossed a place where a colony had died long ago and the radios still told a weather report every morning to no one. It crossed a field of stones that had once been a shipyard built inside a comet. It crossed an orphan moon where the wind had carved teeth into the sand. And all along its long road the beam gathered a little desert on its boots and kept moving. The beam knew nothing about Deathworlders. The beam did not know it carried a rumor. It simply did what signals do. It walked the map drawn for it by the engineer's steady hand and the old law of the machine. Somewhere near the edge of mapped space it reached the place where the charts got shy. Where red lines said here be storms, here be hunger, here be teeth. Even on bright modern maps, some corners still wore the old warnings, and in one of those corners a listening post turned toward the beam as if it had smelled rain. No one on the planet knew about that post. It was a small place made of black plates and stubborn humor, and it hung above a hard blue world that blew lightning into its own clouds. Inside the post, a man with a rope scar on his wrist sat with his boots up on a console and read old news from a place he had never been. An alarm breathed once in his ear and he put his boots down. The display gave him a shape that was not one of theirs. A shape built from math he recognized in his bones. The math of the hard school, the kind that says we are losing, say it clean, and ask. He read the tag that named the invaders and his mouth turned thin. He called down the chain, and the chain answered with a silence that was not sleep. At his back, another watcher leaned forward, then another. A third appeared in the doorway holding a cup of bitter drink and did not sip. For a moment no one spoke, because in rooms like that there are words that live only in the chest. But the rope scar man finally said. One that fit the shape, SOS. He sent a copy along a wire the color of night. And the wire ran into a place whose door was always locked. And the room behind that door breathed out as if it had been waiting. On the planet, the council watched a small green light on a panel that meant nothing to most of them. Only the engineer knew the old code. She looked at the light and understood that the signal had passed the choke points and entered the wide water. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Then she told the leaders the only news she had. It went through. After that there was nothing left to do but wait. The old leader thanked her and put his hand on the ring. The metal was warm and humming like a cat, and he thought of his first child, born during the flood years, the way a whole city had moved upstairs for a season and learned to live close. He thought of the way a shared pot can make strangers sit together without hating, and he wanted that feeling again for his people. But the air smelled like ash, and the enemy ships pulsed above the clouds, and wanting was not a rope you could pull. He told the council to sleep in shifts. He told them to eat something even if it tasted like smoke. He told them to go look at the people they served, not just the maps they moved, and when they had gone, he sat on the step and listened to the machine sing. Because sometimes the only prayer is to listen to the thing you have made and hope it loves you back. Night moved across the world. Though night had not been dark for many days, the fires made their own moons. The enemy left a pair of ships over the capital and pulled the others toward the industrial belt. Where resistance still snapped like a bad wire, the invaders were bored, and boredom made them rough. They dropped a line of mild kinetic strikes on empty fields to see the dirt jump. They played a game with a broken satellite and shot at it when it drifted across the moon. On the ground the people did what people do. The old woman at the corner boiled tea in a dented pot and gave a cup to a boy with black on his hands. The boy said the tea tasted like metal. The woman said better metal than fear. The boy smiled and said better sugar than both. The woman pulled a thin packet from her sleeve. They broke it open and let white fall into the steam. In the hospital, a surgeon with shaking shoulders took 3 breaths before picking up the next tool. In a parking garage, a father taped a drawing to a column. It showed a house with a tree and a window with light, and under it the little letters said "Come home." He did not know who he was asking, the tree, the house, the window, or the light, but he asked anyway. The first change came just before dawn, but it was not a sound, it was a feeling. The watchman by the river lifted his head like a dog hearing its name. The radar set made a soft click and steadied. The nurse on the roof stopped looking at her drifting cloth and stared into the red clouds as if something behind them had moved. The engineer in the chamber below the hall felt the rings hum shift half a note, like a wheel finding a traw track. She looked at the panel and saw a thin spike where there had been a flat line. She did not shout, she did not move, she breathed and kept watching. On the street a small child laughed for no reason and then hid her face in her mother's coat because she felt strange and did not know why. The enemy ships kept their lazy turn. But one of them flicked a light as if its pilot had flinched, and up in the clouds a thin seam of black opened and closed, as quick as a blink. The council gathered again, because gathering was the only tool they had left. They drank water that tasted like copper and looked at maps they could not change and tried to keep their hands flat on the table. One of them started a speech about dignity. The oldest one let him talk because speeches are sometimes a splint for a broken hour. When the speech ran out, the engineer entered. She spoke in the same voice she used when she told a junior how to adjust a coil. The signal had crossed the last registered gate. It was beyond the charts. It was in the places where numbers on old maps turned gray. The room did not cheer. The room did not cry. The room simply breathed out as if a belt had been loosened, and then it breathed in again. Because beyond the charts there were stories. The stories had teeth, and the name that walked with those stories wore many boots: Savior, Wolf, Storm, Human, Deathworlder. No one said the name, but everyone heard it in the way the lamps buzzed. By midday the enemy shifted again, pulling 3 ships back toward the capital. Maybe they had felt the thin quake in the dark. Maybe a shy instrument had told a shy officer that something had winked behind the clouds. The 3 ships took up angles that made a triangle over the city. Triangles are what bored hunters make when they think the prey might bolt. On the ground the soldiers did not point. They kept their eyes down. They checked bandages. They carried clean water. They counted the children twice. The engineer asked for more power for the ring and the grid boss gave it by blinking a set of lights that used to run the fountain on the south circle. The fountain had been dry for days, and somewhere a child would miss its sound. But the ring drank and the hum held. Outside the hall an old man sold boiled roots from a cart he pushed with ropes because the wheels were gone. He cut the roots with a dull knife and told each buyer the same joke, that the roots tasted better than the enemy tasted victory, and people smiled even though the joke was thin. Thin jokes are bridges over deep water. At dusk, the sky lowered like a tired eyelid. Ash fell in soft flakes and made the streets look old. A siren wailed and cut off. Someone misfired a flare and it fizzed against a wall. The mother in the library basement drew a new road that ended at a square with a fountain. Her son asked if the fountain would run again. She said everything that has a shape can be made again if hands are kind. Upstairs in the reading room a poet tore a page from his last book and wrote the words "Please come on." The back because sometimes a prayer needs to stand inside a small house like a page and not a big palace like a speech. The watchman rubbed the radar set and gave it half a cracker. The set did not eat. But the sharing made him feel less alone. And in the ring chamber the engineer checked the cooling valves and thought of the teacher who had once told her that all machines are just slow songs. And she wondered if the ring liked the key they had chosen. Night came without stars, because the fires had claimed the sky, and in the thick red dark the signal reached a place where someone with steady hands and a rope scar had leaned toward a console and said a word that tasted like old duty. And wheels inside big quiet ships turned, and people who measured time in battles instead of seasons set their cups down and stood up. New lines lit on distant boards, not like the messy lines of trade, not like the shouting lines of war, but like the clean lines of a response. The shape of them would not be seen on the planet below until later, but the first breath of that shape touched the edge of things and made a small wind in a hot room. The nurse on the roof felt it and did not know why she smiled. The soldier by the eastern gate felt it and shifted his weight and did not know why his legs felt lighter. The old leader in the hall felt it and pressed his palm to the wood of the table as if a friend had put a hand over his heart, and the engineer heard the ring settle into a smooth note that meant the message had crossed into hands, not just ears. Still, nothing moved in the open, not yet. The enemy ships drifted like they owned gravity. The streets kept their low murmur. The water truck rattled. The cart man sold the last of his roots. The poet folded his page into a small boat and floated it in a basin because even dry fountains can hold a sea if you ask them to pretend. The mother put the chalk away. The child slept with a toy wheel in his fist, and the waiting thickened again. Because waiting always thickens before change. It piles up like snow before a roof falls. The whole city leaned into the hour, bent under it, held its breath. It had sent a voice into the dark and now it stood in a doorway between what was and what could be. And the doorway was narrow, and the floor shook with far thunder, and the walls smelled like ash. But the doorway was still a doorway, and that alone was a kind of miracle. The oldest leader went outside alone. He walked along a path where the lanterns had burned out. He touched the soot on the stones and the soot touched him back. He looked up at the red dome that used to be his sky and he said the small names of the people he had lost. He said them in the right order because names like to be in their families. He ended with the name of the city itself and he asked it to hold. Just hold a little. A river does not move a mountain, but sometimes a river draws a line around a mountain and tells it where to stand. The city was the mountain now, he was the river, and words were his water. When he finished he put his hand on the nearest wall and felt the vibration again. Like lightning that had not decided where to strike. He did not smile, but he straightened his back, and when he turned back to the hall his steps were even. When he reached the door, the engineer was waiting with a quiet face. She said there was no reply, not yet. But the grid had recorded a shift in the long bands that meant somebody had listened hard. And sometimes listening is the first half of answering. He nodded. He said they would keep the ring singing until the coils grew too hot or the city ran out of night. Whichever came last, she said the coils would hold. She had built them with hands that understood stubborn. He thanked her not for the machine, but for the way she touched it like a friend. They went inside, and in the chamber the low lamps made everyone look like they were carved out of the same soft stone. It made them look like they belonged to each other again. Which they did, even if fear had tried to make them forget. They sat, they listened, they waited, which are three hard verbs, and the night pressed its ear to the door of dawn. Far away, where charts go blind and rumors learn to put on boots, a small light on a blackboard turned from quiet to ready, and a line that had slept since the last time somebody begged the stars woke up and walked toward a bell. And though the bell did not ring in the city, not yet, the shape of its sound began to spill forward through the places between places, and that shape was the hook of this night, the unseen curve that would catch on the ribs of everything that came next, on the planet. Below, no one knew the name of the person who had stood up in that other room. No one knew the shape of their scar or the way their coffee tasted. They only knew that a message had left their hands and entered the long dark, and the long dark had twitched, and the twitch meant maybe, and maybe is the smallest seed in the world, and also the strongest. They held it together, a city of small seeds in ash, and above them the enemy ships shifted again in a way that looked like boredom and felt like a flinch, and deep under the hall the ring's hum went on, steady as breath, steady as a drum in a parade that had not yet turned the corner, and the signal they had thrown like a spear kept flying, kept flying, kept flying, past the place where maps get scared, into the place where legends are kept awake at night by the sound of someone knocking on the door. The signal had been sent, but the world did not change, not at once, not in any way they could see. The cities still burned, the invaders' ships still hung above like blades, the smell of smoke still clung to every corner of every street. The people whispered in their shelters, hoping the message had reached someone, fearing it had reached no one, and more than anything fearing that it had reached the wrong kind of listener. In the markets, now little more than ruins, old men muttered about predators in the dark, about mercenaries who fed on suffering, about scavenger fleets that would hear the call and come to strip the planet clean. Mothers hushed their children when the word Deathworlders was spoken, but the children whispered it anyway, rolling it like a secret stone on their tongues, because fear was heavy, but legends made it strange and almost bearable. In the council hall, the leaders sat in silence after the machine had gone quiet. The hum of the signal ring still trembled in their bones, as if part of it had sunk into the floor and stayed there, but the chamber itself was hollow with waiting. One counselor slammed his hand on the table, demanding to know how long they would wait, demanding to know what hope there was in calling for ghosts. Another argued back that silence was not hopelessness, that the stars were wide, that even the fastest reply might take days. A third broke down in tears, whispering that they had doomed themselves, that the invaders would sense the call and strike harder. The elder counselor lifted his voice above the clamor, reminding them all that the choice had been made, that their fleet was gone, their weapons broken, and that silence was better than nothing. His words carried weight, but even he felt the gnaw of dread deep in his chest. Above the planet, the invaders tightened their orbit. Their commanders had not detected the signal, not yet, but some instinct made them restless. They shifted ships into new positions, closing their net around the surface as if they could smell the defiance still burning in the ashes. On the ground, soldiers watched with hollow eyes, knowing that the enemy could strike whenever it chose. They trained anyway, drilling with rifles that barely worked, digging trenches that could never hold back fire from the sky. It was not logic that kept them moving, it was rhythm, the rhythm of survival, of doing something, anything, so that despair would not consume them whole. In the homes, families huddled together, telling stories to drive back the silence. Some spoke of ancient allies who might come, of forgotten treaties and friendships long past. Others spoke of humanity, the Deathworlders, voices low and trembling. No one knew if the stories were true. Some said the humans lived on a world of endless storms and predators, where every step was a battle, and that surviving such a place had forged them into iron. Others said they were monsters who destroyed as easily as they saved, storms wearing flesh, and that to summon them was to risk trading one doom for another. But even the harshest doubters admitted one thing: if anyone in the galaxy could face the invaders, it was the Deathworlders. The waiting stretched the night thin. Hours felt like years. The watchmen at the river checked their radars again and again, but nothing new came, only the steady pulse of enemy ships above. The engineer in the signal chamber sat beside the ring, running her hand along its warm edge, listening to the hum as if it might speak again, as if it might tell her where the message had gone, who had heard, and what they would do. She whispered to it like a friend, telling it to hold, telling it not to break before the answer came. Morning arrived gray and heavy. Ash fell like snow over the ruins, coating broken walls and shattered statues. The people emerged from their shelters, blinking in the pale light, and for a brief moment it almost looked like peace. But then the sound of engines rolled across the sky, and the enemy fired another warning strike, a beam of light that reduced an empty quarter of the city to rubble. Dust clouds rose like ghosts, and the screams of frightened children carried through the streets. The invaders were reminding them of their place, reminding them that nothing had changed. And still the people whispered about the signal, asking if it had gone far enough, asking if someone strong enough to fight for them had heard. The council gathered again that evening, voices hushed, faces drawn. Some wanted to prepare for surrender, to send word to the invaders before they burned the entire world. Others still clung to hope, pointing to the stories, to the legends, to the Deathworlders who were said to never ignore a cry for help. The elder counselor, weary but unbroken, told them that silence was not the same as abandonment. He said that sometimes the stars took their time, that answers moved slow but sure. His words steadied the room for a moment, but outside, in the streets, the people felt only the heavy ache of waiting. And then, late that night, a watchman at the river heard something. It was not clear, not strong, just a faint quiver on his screen. A pulse where none had been before. He leaned forward, wiped his tired eyes, checked again. It was there. A shape moving at the edge of the system, far beyond the reach of their own ships, far beyond where any ally should be. He whispered a single word to himself, his voice trembling. Answer. He did not know who it was. He did not know if it was salvation or something worse. But for the first time since the city had begun to burn, his heart lifted, because the silence of the stars was breaking. The signal had gone out, the faint pulse had been caught at the edge of the system, and yet the people on the burning planet did not know. They only had whispers, and whispers were dangerous because they grew sharper in the dark. In the ruined streets, soldiers leaned against broken walls, their armor dented and scorched, telling stories they half believed, stories about Deathworlders. They spoke of men and women born on a world that hated life, a world where storms never rested, where beasts hunted in packs, where the air itself carried poisons and the seas swallowed whole cities, and yet somehow humanity had not only survived, they had risen. The younger soldiers listened with wide eyes, asking if such beings were saviors or monsters, and the veterans shook their heads, because the truth was that no one really knew. The name Deathworlders carried both fear and hope in equal measure, and no one could decide which side of it was heavier. In the council chamber, the debates grew sharper, voices clashing like swords. One counselor shouted that they had doomed themselves by calling into the unknown, that even if the Deathworlders came, they might bring destruction greater than the invaders above. Another argued that their world was already dying, that calling for help had been their only chance, and that even monsters were better than silence. A third slammed his hand on the table, demanding that they prepare to surrender before the invaders decided to erase them completely. The elder counselor listened, his face lined with exhaustion, and finally he spoke, his voice steady but low. He told them that survival was never clean, that help was never simple, and that the Deathworlders were not creatures of mercy or cruelty, but creatures of necessity. He said they fought because they had always fought, because their own world had trained them to survive or die, and that if the Deathworlders had heard the cry, they would come, not as angels, not as demons, but as storms. In the streets, people gathered in the ruins of markets and squares, their faces lit by the glow of scattered fires. Children asked their parents if the Deathworlders would save them, if they would come with shining ships and bring food and safety. Parents hesitated before answering, their voices soft, telling them that the humans were strong, stronger than the enemies above, but their eyes betrayed their fear. The elders told stories of times when Deathworlders had fought alongside weaker races, when they had turned battles with their stubbornness and strength. But there were other stories too, darker ones, of wars where humans had shown no mercy, where they had fought until nothing was left alive. The people whispered these tales back and forth, their voices trembling, torn between gratitude for the chance of salvation and dread of what that salvation might cost. Far above, the invader fleet still hung like a knife, but the commanders grew uneasy. Their sensors picked up faint disturbances in the far dark, signals too irregular to be background noise, too large to be dismissed as debris. They laughed in arrogance, telling their crews it was nothing, but in their private chambers, fear gnawed at them. They remembered the rumors too. They remembered the word that haunted old records, humans, Deathworlders. They had dismissed them as myths, as scattered mercenaries long gone, but now the thought crept into their hearts like poison. What if the legends were true, and what if their prey had summoned storms greater than their own? In the quiet of night, a watchman at the river kept staring at his screen, the faint pulse repeating, steady, growing clearer with each cycle. He felt his hands tremble as he whispered to himself again, answer. He did not know who they were. He did not know if it was salvation or the end. But deep in his chest, a spark lit, a spark of belief that something was coming, something vast, something that would shake the sky itself. And in the endless dark beyond the stars, something did stir. Engines that had slept woke with a growl, fleets shifted in silence, and voices cold and calm began to speak orders. The Deathworlders had heard. The galaxy did not yet know it, the planet could not yet see it, but the first shadow of their coming had already fallen, and when they arrived, no one, enemy, ally, or victim, would ever see the galaxy the same way again. The night sky above the broken planet glowed with red clouds and drifting ash, the air heavy with smoke and sorrow, but the people no longer stared only at the firestorms left by the invaders. They stared upward, searching for shapes they could not name, waiting for something they did not dare to believe in. The invader fleet still hung above them, cruel and confident, their dark ships circling like blades, engines pulsing in arrogant rhythm. Yet there was a shift now, a weight in the air, a tremor that only the most watchful could feel. On the edge of the system, something vast had stirred, and the enemy scouts had already noticed. At first, their sensors caught it as noise, a ripple against the void, but the ripple grew clearer, sharper, until even the bravest captains felt a knees gnaw at their pride. In the council chamber, the leaders gathered again. Their faces were drawn and pale, their voices raw from endless arguments, but this time there was no shouting. The air itself seemed heavy, and every ear strained toward the comm lines, waiting for news. The elder counselor leaned forward on the table, his old hands trembling as he whispered, "They are coming." Some counselors looked at him with fear, others with hope, but none dared to laugh. The engineer burst into the chamber moments later, her uniform streaked with soot, her voice quick as she explained that distant sensors, old, forgotten instruments buried in the mountains, were catching signals too large to ignore. "It's not the invaders," she said. This is something else." The room went still, and then one word passed from mouth to mouth like fire: Deathworlders. Above the planet, the invaders stirred. Their commanders had begun to notice the changes too, and though they shouted orders with pride, fear crept into their movements. They repositioned ships into tighter formation, pulled scouts back from the edges, and charged weapons in preparation. But for all their noise and fire, they could not silence the growing tremor in the void. Then, it happened. Out beyond the orbit of the outermost moon, a shadow appeared, vast, heavy, deliberate. It was not one ship but many, dozens sliding into real space with the precision of a blade. Their engines burned blue and white, cutting through the dark like suns, and their hulls bore scars of old battles, proof of survival carved in steel. More ships followed, row after row, until the stars themselves seemed to vanish behind their mass. The people of the planet saw it first as new stars rising through the smoke, stars that moved where no stars should. Children pointed, their small hands trembling, while parents pulled them close, unable to look away. Soldiers in the ruins dropped their rifles and stood frozen, their mouths dry, their hearts thundering. Whispers spread like lightning through the streets. They came, they really came. The word Deathworlders was spoken again, no longer as legend but as truth. The enemy fleet panicked. Their commanders shouted to hold the lines, to remind their crews that the humans were only myth, but the sight of the fleet shattered their certainty. The Deathworlder armada moved with terrifying discipline, every ship sliding into perfect formation, their weapons systems glowing, their shields shimmering with cold blue fire. It was not the movement of prey, nor even of predators. It was the movement of a storm that had been waiting for centuries to be unleashed. Then, the comms crackled across the ruined planet. A voice spoke, calm, deep, carrying more weight than a fleet of warships. It was the voice of the human commander. "This is the Deathworlder fleet," he said. "We received your call. Identify your enemy." The words echoed in every council chamber, in every street, in every shelter. People gasped, some fell to their knees, others wept openly. The elder counselor rose to his feet, tears in his eyes, and answered with a voice steady despite his age. He named the invaders, spoke their crimes, told of the burning cities and broken families, and when he finished, there was silence. No reply came, only the steady hum of human ships as they readied for war. In orbit, the enemy tried to rally. Their warlords barked commands, telling their fleets to fire first, to strike before the humans could, but even their own officers hesitated. They had heard the old stories too. They had mocked them once, but now, with the Deathworlder armada before their eyes, the stories returned in full force. And then the first shot was fired, not by the invaders, but by the humans. A beam of pure white fire lanced through the void, faster than the enemy could react, and tore an enemy battleship in half. The explosion lit the system like a second sun. The people on the ground gasped and cheered, their voices mixing with cries of fear, because the truth was clear, the war was no longer theirs. It had become a clash of giants. Ship after ship ignited in the sky as the Deathworlders advanced. Their weapons cut through armor like paper, their formations shifted with perfect unity, and their silence was more terrifying than any battle cry. The invaders broke, their ships scattering, some trying to flee, others charging forward in desperation. But every move was answered, every strike turned back, until the sky above the planet burned with wreckage and flame. The people watched in awe, their hearts torn between joy and dread. They had been saved, but they had also summoned something beyond their understanding, something that fought like gods of war. By the time the battle reached its peak, the outcome was already written. The Deathworlder fleet pressed forward, unstoppable, merciless, and yet controlled. They did not waste fire, they did not break formation. They moved like one mind, one hand. When the last enemy cruiser exploded, scattering pieces into the void, silence fell again, heavy and vast. The humans did not celebrate. They did not boast. Their ships hung above the world like silent judges, waiting, watching. And on the ground, the people held their breath, realizing that survival had come, but salvation was something else entirely. The sky shook like a drum even though no weapon touched the ground. The thunder lived above the clouds where the Deathworlder fleet drove into the invaders, and every rumble rolled through the bones of the city. In the council hall the leaders stood around the old table and watched pale screens flicker with shapes they barely understood, lines for ships, points for missiles, arcs for energy, and through it all a steady voice cut in and out. The same human commander who had asked them to name their enemy. He did not speak like a conqueror. He spoke like a surgeon calling for tools, short words, exact orders, no waste, and each time he spoke another bright mark on the screen went dark. One more enemy cruiser split open like a seed in fire. People in the streets cried out without meaning to. Relief and fear twisting together because rescue had the face of a storm. In the hospital the windows shook and dust fell from the lights. Nurses held children against their shoulders. Doctors kept their hands steady on wounds that did not wait for victory. And over the roof a strange glow spread for a breath. A soft sheet of blue that hummed like a far wind. The engineer in the signal chamber saw the glow on a small meter and whispered that the Deathworlders were angling shots away from population centers. That they were shaping the battle like water around stone. It was not mercy as a song, it was mercy as a calculation, and yet it saved lives just the same. A beam that might have sliced a tower bent 30 meters high and turned an empty warehouse to glass instead. A volley that could have torn the river bridge broke itself on a point defense wall that seemed to appear from nothing. People lifted their eyes and saw nothing but ash and red cloud. But the city felt the difference in the way the ground did not fall. The invaders tried to gather. They pulled their ships into a hard shell. They launched swarms of guided fire. They threw decoys like sparks. But the Deathworlder formations shifted with frightening ease. Wedges opened and closed. Screens flared and faded. Trap lines appeared where no trap had existed a heartbeat before. And when an enemy captain thought he had found a gap, he found a knife instead. The human voice never shouted. It simply said numbers and vectors and names, and ships obeyed as if the voice lived inside them. The watchman by the river leaned close to his old set and mouthed the orders as if he could help push them along. In a basement classroom a teacher traced the same dance with her finger on the floor so the children would see that a pattern was guarding them, not chaos. For a breath the enemy managed to strike back hard. 3 heavy cruisers broke through the outer ring and drove toward the equator. Their guns flaring in angry rhythm. One turned its mouth toward the capital. People in the open squares froze like animals hearing a branch break. The council stared at the long line coming down the map, and someone began to pray out loud. But before the line could touch the city, a thin spike of light lanced across the screen from the far side of the system. No roar, no boast, just a single cut, and the cruiser that had aimed at them folded like wet paper. Its fire went dark. Its pieces turned and drifted. The other 2 tried to turn away, but a net they could not see closed around them. Small fast shapes bit their engines out from under them and left them falling dumb and slow. The old leader put his hands flat on the table and kept them there until they stopped shaking. Down among the ruins the soldiers finally let themselves breathe. Some laughed and then covered their mouths because laughter felt wrong. Some cried and did not hide it. One young sergeant took off his helmet and held it against his chest because he did not trust his knees. He watched the sky and told himself to remember this exact color. The mixed red and black with new blue lines moving through it like veins. Because he wanted evidence that impossible things could happen near the eastern gate. The root seller rolled his empty cart under an arch and sat down. He wiped his knife on his sleeve and told the nearest guard that the Deathworlders fought like rain, not like fire. The guard asked what that meant, and the old man said rain does not hate. It falls where it must and it wears stone away. The enemy admiral finally spoke across open space, a harsh voice full of brittle pride, demanding terms, threatening planets he had never seen, throwing titles like rocks. The human commander answered with silence for a full breath, and in that silence the invader's words turned small and cold. When the human voice came back it said only this: disengage and withdraw beyond the outer marker. Leave all captured assets, cease fire. No negotiation while civilian targets are in range. The admiral laughed and sent a scatter of missiles toward a power station on the night side. The Deathworlders did not answer with more words, they answered with timing. The missiles died 6,000 meters short in a grid no one on the planet had known existed. Then 5 precise strikes cut the admiral's flagship along its spine and turned his laugh into static. The rest of the enemy command chatter shook into panic, orders collided, formations bled, courage ran out. The council waited for the demand they feared, tribute or oaths or occupation. But none came. The human voice left their channels and spoke only to its ships, and the ships went on with their work, clearing mines, pushing wrecks towards safe decay, tagging escape pods for recovery, sending small craft to nudge burning hulks away from orbital paths that would drop them on cities. It was protection without warmth, function without kindness, and somehow that made it easier to trust. Because it asked for nothing while giving only what the battle required. The engineer watched a graph that showed falling debris paths shrink from a scatter to a handful. She pressed her hand to the panel and said thank you in a voice too low for anyone to hear. On the ground, people began to come out of shadows, not many, not far, just to doorways and stairheads and the edges of courtyards. They lifted their faces to the trembling glow above and let relief touch them like a shy animal. A mother uncurled her fists and found she had been holding her child's sleeve so hard the fabric had wrinkled. She smoothed it and kissed the crease as if that could fix the day. The poet in the library unfolded his small paper boat and wrote 2 more words on it. Still here, then folded it again and tucked it in his pocket because he wanted to show it to someone later. The watchman tapped the old radar set and promised to oil it tomorrow. The set gave a proud beep as if to say it had done its part. The invaders broke, not all at once, but in stumbles and lurches. A cluster fled for the outer dark and found 2 human cruisers waiting like quiet gates. A squadron tried to hide behind the moon and met a sweep that drew them out like fish from a rock. A last pair charged straight at the largest human ship in a gesture that wanted to be brave. The big ship did not move, it let them come. It opened a window of white and both ships simply vanished without smoke, without debris, like names erased. From a list, the soldiers in the streets looked at one another and did not cheer. They simply nodded as if a promise had been kept that none of them had dared to speak. When the fighting thinned to the sound of sparks, a new message arrived on the planet's open bands, a short list of coordinates and a single instruction. Evacuate these zones within 10 minutes. Then a countdown began, no threat, no explanation, just numbers falling. The council argued for 3 seconds, then sent runners, and the city moved like a muscle. People shifted across courtyards, carried the wounded downstairs, pushed carts through ash. 10 minutes later the ground under those coordinates jumped with muffled force as the Deathworlders burned drifting ordnance in low air and cracked a damaged reactor casing in an empty block rather than let it melt through a hospital wall. The shock rolled harmless because the streets had been cleared, and for the first time since the siege began the city felt like it had made a decision and seen it work. At last the sky quieted, the enemy traces thinned to cold sparks. The Deathworlder fleet slowed and held station, not triumphant, not restless, simply present. Their silhouettes hung like mountains drawn by a steady hand. The human commander returned to the planet's bands and spoke in that same level voice. Your skies are presently under protection. Cease surface transmissions except medical and rescue. Remain under shelter until further notice. We will advise. Then the channel closed, and the quiet that followed was heavier than any noise, because now the question everyone had pressed down into their bones rose to the skin. What would these humans ask? What would they take? What would they leave behind besides wreckage and a new shape in the story the planet told itself at night? The old leader walked out onto the hall steps and looked up through the ash. He did not try to speak to the crowd. There was nothing to say that would be true and strong enough to hold. He simply raised one hand and the gesture meant live, not celebrate, not kneel, just live. The people answered with small movements, a head bowed, a fist lifted to a heart, a hand placed gently on a neighbor's shoulder. And in a narrow alley the root seller took a fresh knife from his pocket, a little one he had saved for a good day. He cut a sliver from the last sweet root and held it up to the sky. For rain, he said, for stone, for those who fall and for those who stand. Then he ate it and smiled because for the first time in many days he could taste more than smoke. Night bled into a softer red, the fires shrank at the edges, and a breeze wandered the streets like a shy child. People felt it on their faces and turned toward it as if it were an answer. Above them the Deathworlders waited without moving, and below them the city exhaled, not in joy, not yet, but in the plain relief that comes when a blade is lifted from a throat. The battle was not a story they would ever own. It belonged to the ones who fought like rain, but the breathing belonged to them. And they took it back, and in that breathing a new fear and a new hope grew side by side, because dawn would bring words from the fleet, and words can be sharper than beams when they tell you the price of being saved. The battle was finished. The sky above the planet no longer roared with fire, and yet the silence felt heavier than war. The Deathworlder fleet hung in orbit, dark silhouettes like mountains in the void, their engines glowing faintly as if even at rest they carried storms inside them. Below, the ruined planet trembled not from bombardments but from the weight of waiting. The people crowded in streets black with ash, their faces tilted toward the heavens, their breaths short and uneven. They had survived the invaders, but now they faced a new question, the price of survival. In the council chamber the leaders gathered again, their bodies bent with exhaustion. They stared at the screens showing the silent fleet above, at the unreadable lines of ships spread across the sky. Some argued they should send gratitude at once, kneel before their rescuers, offer gifts, swear loyalty. Others warned against it, whispering that the Deathworlders might see kneeling as weakness and weakness as an invitation. The chamber filled with voices until the elder counselor lifted his hand. His voice was steady, though his shoulders shook. "We asked for help," he said, "and they came. But help is never free. We must be ready to hear their terms, whatever they may be." The people outside did not argue in chambers, they argued in the streets. Some cried that the Deathworlders were saviors, that no other race had ever come to their aid. They spoke of mercy, of protection, of legends reborn as truth. Others muttered that they had traded one master for another, that the humans would not leave without carving their mark deep into this world. Fear and hope lived side by side, and no one knew which was stronger. Children pointed at the glowing shapes in the sky, asking if the humans would come down to the streets, if they would bring food, if they would stay. Parents gave no answers, because answers felt dangerous. Above the planet the Deathworlder fleet shifted, a single massive ship moving forward. Its size dwarfed even the largest of the invaders, its hull scarred with marks of 100 old battles. Every eye turned upward as it passed, slow and deliberate, like a predator circling. Then the comms opened again, the human commander's voice spreading through every channel. His tone was calm, but each word carried weight like stone. "Your skies are clear. Your enemy has been destroyed. But hear this, no cry for help goes unanswered without cost. Do you understand?" The words rippled across the world. In the council hall the leaders froze, some pale with fear, others bracing as if struck. The elder counselor stepped forward to answer, his voice trembling yet clear. He thanked the humans for their aid, for saving what was left of their people, and he asked what cost must be paid. The silence that followed stretched so long that it pressed on the heart like a blade. Then the commander spoke again, slower, colder. "We ask no tribute of riches. We do not take slaves. We do not rule worlds. Our price is this: never call for us unless you are ready for what follows. Survival is not given. It is bought with blood, and it changes everything." The words fell heavy. Relief mingled with fear. The council whispered among themselves, struggling to understand. No tribute, no occupation, but a warning. The humans had come because of the SOS, but their aid was not kindness. It was survival shared from one people to another, survival that demanded strength, not dependence. The elder counselor bowed his head and said they understood. The channel closed without further reply. In the streets, the people reacted in waves. Some cheered, raising their voices in joy that the Deathworlders had not enslaved them, that they demanded no gold, no chains. Others shuddered, muttering that the warning was sharper than any threat. The soldiers were divided too. Some saluted the sky, proud to be alive under the shadow of such warriors, while others looked down at their rifles, wondering if the Deathworlders would one day turn their weapons on them as easily as they had on the invaders. The fleet did not leave at once. Their ships lingered in silence, patrolling, scanning, clearing debris. They moved wreckage from orbit so it would not fall on the cities. They burned drifting enemy weapons before they could crash into hospitals. They marked escape pods for pickup. Their presence was protection, but it was also a reminder. The humans were watchers now, and the world below lived under their gaze. That night, the elder counselor walked among the ruins with no guards. People stopped him in the streets, asking if the humans would stay, asking if they were safe. He told them only the truth he knew, that they were alive, that survival was never free, and that they must rebuild with their own hands before calling on the Deathworlders again. He did not say what lay heavy in his heart, that their world was now marked forever, that others in the galaxy would hear of this and come to test them, that enemies might return stronger, and that the Deathworlders would not always arrive in time. In the quiet hours before dawn, when fires had burned low and the people had fallen into uneasy sleep, the Deathworlder fleet shifted once more. Their massive ships turned slowly toward the void, engines burning like suns. They did not announce their departure. They did not give promises. They simply began to vanish into the black, one by one, until only silence remained. And as the last ship faded from the sky, the people realized they had been given both a gift and a burden. They had been saved, but the shadow of the Deathworlders would follow them forever. The children asked again if the humans would come back. This time their parents whispered the only answer they could give. Only if we call. Only if the stars hear us again. And the weight of that answer settled into every heart, for now they knew what it meant to send a desperate cry, and what it meant when the Deathworlders answered. The Deathworlder fleet had vanished into the void, leaving behind silence that was louder than battle. Their engines no longer lit the night sky, their shadows no longer covered the burning clouds, but their presence still weighed heavy on the ruined planet. People whispered in streets of ash, telling each other the humans were gone, telling themselves it was over, but in every whisper lived the echo of the warning they had left behind. Do not call unless you are ready for what follows. The words rolled through markets, through schools, through broken homes, and they carried both comfort and fear. In the council chamber, the leaders sat in a circle, their shoulders bent, their voices hushed. They argued not about survival, for survival had been granted, but about meaning. One counselor said the humans had shown mercy, that they had fought without asking payment, that this was proof the Deathworlders were saviors. Another countered that mercy had nothing to do with it, that the humans fought because war lived in their blood, and that their aid was as dangerous as their wrath. A third whispered that they should never send another call, that even if enemies returned it would be better to fall than to summon storms like that again. The elder counselor shook his head. His voice was tired but steady as he told them survival was never free, that they had been saved but also marked, and that from now on the galaxy would look at them differently, not as prey, but as bait that could draw Deathworlders back into the light. Far beyond their skies, in the wreckage of the enemy fleet, a handful of broken ships limped away, their hulls torn, their crews shattered. Inside the flagship's remains, the surviving commanders sat in silence, their pride burned away, their faces pale. They spoke of what they had seen, of ships that moved with impossible precision, of weapons that tore through armor like paper, of voices that commanded as if the void itself obeyed. They remembered the stories, the old warnings that had been dismissed as myth, and they knew now that those stories were truth. The Deathworlders lived, and they were as terrible as legend promised. Rage filled the room, a rage born not from strength but from shame. They swore revenge, swore that humanity would not remain the galaxy's storm, swore they would gather allies, build weapons, do whatever it took to end the Deathworlders before fear of them grew too wide. Rumors spread fast across the stars. Traders who had passed through the system carried tales of the battle. They spoke of wreckage scattered like dust across orbit, of an armada that appeared from nowhere, fought like a storm, and vanished just as quickly. Some called it a miracle, others called it a curse. On distant worlds, rulers whispered in dark halls. Some trembled at the thought that the Deathworlders answered when called, fearing that one day their own enemies might summon them. Others saw opportunity, imagining their own cries for help drawing the storm against their rivals. The galaxy stirred with old fear and new hope, for the name that had been nearly forgotten was spoken again in every corner. Humans, Deathworlders. On the ruined planet itself, life began to move again, though it was fragile and uncertain. Children played in streets of rubble, their games shaped by what they had seen. They built small fleets from broken wood and stone, pretending to command Deathworlder ships that cut through enemies with beams of light. Their laughter carried into the air, a thin sound, but a sound of life. Soldiers repaired weapons and drilled in silence, swearing to never be caught helpless again. Farmers cleared fields choked with ash, planting seeds even while fires still smoldered on the horizon. The people were alive, but every action was shadowed by memory. They could not forget the sight of enemy fleets breaking, nor the weight of human words. The elder counselor walked through the city each day, his steps slow, his eyes heavy. People stopped him, asking if the humans would come back, asking if they should send thanks into the sky, asking if they should fear or pray. He told them the same answer every time. They will come if you call, but be certain of what you want. The Deathworlders do not bring peace. They bring survival. And survival always has a cost. His words spread through the people, carving themselves into their hearts, until even children could recite them like an old proverb. And in the deep night, when the city was quiet and the fires low, the sky seemed different. The stars looked closer, sharper, as if they too were listening. Some people said it was imagination, others said it was fear. But in truth, far out in the void, fleets moved quietly, carrying scars of survival, carrying the name that now belonged to them again. The Deathworlders. They had answered one cry, and they would answer another. And the galaxy itself trembled at the thought of the next desperate voice that would rise into the stars. The planet woke each day to a quiet that felt wrong. The fires were lower now, the smoke thinned by wind, but the quiet did not mean safety. It meant the city was listening. It meant every ear turned to the sky to hear if thunder would come back. Workers cleared streets with bent backs and sore hands. Soldiers lifted beams and carried water when there were no patrols to walk. Children drew ships in the dust and gave them names they could not pronounce, Deathworlder names with hard edges, and the elders watched and told them to be gentle even with chalk, because gentleness was a muscle they could not afford to lose. The council rebuilt the radios, set up food lines, opened shelters to daylight. They hung lists of missing names on a wall and added flowers where they could. People stopped there and touched letters with the same care they used to touch a door before entering a home. The engineer brought the signal ring down to idle and laid blankets over it like a sleeping animal. She patted its rim each morning and said thank you, then went upstairs to fix wires and teach young hands how to tie a safe knot. The city was moving again, but it moved like a person who had learned to walk after an injury, slow, careful, always aware of pain waiting in the next step. Far away, in halls of steel and cold light, the enemy empire did not sleep. Their surviving captains stood before their warlords and spoke in voices that trembled. They described the human fleet, the way it moved like a single creature, the way one voice could turn 10 ships into a line sharper than a blade, the way beams cut without waste, the way mercy never softened precision. The warlords listened, their jaws tight, their eyes like knives. They asked the same question again and again. How did the humans appear so fast? Who warned them? Who called them? And each time the answer was the same, an SOS, a narrow cry that slipped through nets and found something in the dark. The word Deathworlders passed around the room like a hot stone. No one wanted to hold it for long, but no one could drop it either. Pride hurt more than wounds, and pride demanded an answer. Plans began in whispers, then in lists. They would build ships with thicker skins. They would sharpen their jamming until no cry could pass. They would hire hunters who knew human tricks. They would map every old story and look for a weak seam. And above all, they would strike where the Deathworlders would not expect, not at armies, but at those who called for help, At the small worlds that had become proof the humans still answered, they would make examples, and in the making they would bait the storm. Rumors traveled faster than trade. Traders who crossed the scarred system carried news in low voices. They brought cloth and grain and filters. They brought nails and small cakes wrapped in paper, and with each bundle they brought the same questions. Did the Deathworlders truly come? Did they speak? Did they ask for tribute? Did they take anyone away? The people answered as plainly as they could. Yes, they came. Yes, they spoke. No, they did not take coin or chains. No, they did not stay. The traders nodded and their eyes turned distant, already measuring how that answer would change prices in places farther along the stars. In border bars, pilots leaned over chipped cups and told one another that the galaxy had turned a corner without asking permission. That a single call could bring a storm. Smugglers whispered that the smartest cargo now was information about cries for help. Politicians on richer worlds held quiet meetings and made new rules about who could access long-range beacons. Priests wrote new lines in old prayers, and war colleges dusted off files marked with human flags and added fresh pages. The planet did not want to be the center of any of this, but it had become a symbol, and symbols do not get to choose where they travel. On the ground the symbol felt heavy. Strangers arrived with sympathy and with measuring eyes. Some gave true aid. Some asked too many questions. A few tried to sell protection stones against Deathworlder wrath. The soldiers turned those sellers away with tired kindness. The council set simple rules. No weapons in the markets. No spying on hospitals. No questions at the wall of names. If you bring help you can stay. If you bring trouble you must go. The rules were not brave, but they were firm. The elder counselor signed each one with a hand that trembled less each day. He ate with workers at long tables and let children climb onto his knees to ask if the fountain would ever run again. He told them yes, because some answers had to be yes, even if the pipes were broken. The engineer sat in the empty fountain bowl at dusk and traced the old pump lines with her finger. She said out loud how they would route the new intake, how they would seal the cracks, how they would clean the filters. She spoke as if to apprentices who were not there, and after a while apprentices did come, because hope attracts hands. At night the city dreamed of light and woke to ash, but even ash can be swept, and every morning more of the ash was gone. The poet took his small paper boat from his pocket and set it on a puddle left by the water truck. It floated and bumped the curb and he laughed like a boy. Then he wrote a new line on the wall near the lists, "Still here, still us." The root seller sharpened his new knife on a stone and sliced thin slivers for nurses who passed on their way to the morning shift. He said the taste would remind them of rain, and a few smiled because the old man believed the sky would listen if invited politely enough. In the barracks a young sergeant hung a hand-drawn map of the battle on the wall. Not the whole thing. Only the part where 3 enemy cruisers aimed at the capital and then vanished. He circled the moment with a blue pencil and wrote above it, "Remember this, because some lessons are heavy and must be lifted together." Beyond sight, the enemy empire tested new machines in quiet sectors, jammers that reached into the long bands where the old ring spoke, false beacons that mimicked SOS patterns to see who might come, minds that listened for the shape of a human engine and learned to pretend to be stars until it was time to open. They built training halls and told their young officers stories about human cruelty. They showed them wreckage and called it weakness. They taught them to hate what they feared. They recruited allies with gifts and threats, promising a place in a future where Deathworlders would be hunted like beasts, in secret rooms. However, their smartest minds asked questions their leaders did not love. What if hate made them clumsy? What if the only way to beat a storm was to become a better roof? What if protecting their own worlds was stronger than breaking someone else's? Those quiet questions did not stop the plans, but they sat like stones in the mouth. News of those preparations reached the ruined planet in fragments, a whisper from a trader, a coded note from a sympathetic port officer, a rumor in the mouth of a refugee who had seen new shipyards light the night over a cold moon. The council listened and did not panic. Panic had burned out of them. They made lists instead. They marked likely points of return. They moved grain stores underground. They taught more people to run the signal ring though they swore to let it sleep. They dug new shelters near schools and markets. They trained watch teams to track debris paths and identify false flares. They asked the engineer to build small beacons that spoke only to local ears, so that help within the city could move faster without calling beyond the sky. The engineer smiled at that, because building for the nearest hands was a kind of happiness she understood. In the evenings the elders sat with teenagers on the steps of the hall and told the long story of the Deathworlders in simple words, not to frighten but to straighten spines. They said the humans were not gods and not demons. They were people formed by a hard place. They answered cries because their own bones remembered hunger. They warned because they knew the shape of consequence. The teenagers asked hard questions. Would the humans come back if the enemy returned? Would they help again if the price was high? Would they punish the planet for calling twice? The elders said answers are not promises, and promises are not armor. You build the armor with your own hands and you wear it even when the sky looks kind. The teenagers nodded and some went to the training fields, others to the clinics, others to the pump works where the fountain's pipes were being repaired. The city was stitching itself back together with thread made from many small decisions. On a hill outside the capital, a memorial took shape, not a tall thing, not a proud thing, just a circle of stones taken from fallen buildings. In the center lay a shard of enemy hull, black and pitted. Beside it, a twisted strip of plating from a Deathworlder missile that had burned out harmlessly over a school. Children placed flowers between the stones. Soldiers left unit patches. The engineer laid a wrench across the hull shard and said, "May our tools be needed more than our prayers." The elder counselor spoke only once. He said, "We are alive." That is the first line. What we become now will be the rest of the poem. People nodded because simple words felt right, and the poet wrote them down for the wall. As the memorial grew, so did the shadow of attention. New ships in orbit asked permission to land and brought cameras with their crates of medical foam and wire. The council allowed a little and refused a lot. They said the story was not a stage. They said the planet was not a backdrop for someone else's fear or admiration. Some visitors understood, others argued, a few left angry. It did not matter. The city had learned to choose its own angles. It had learned that being a symbol meant setting boundaries or being eaten by someone else's meaning. The Deathworlders had not taught them that lesson. But the memory of the fleet made saying no easier. When the fountain finally ran, the first water came out brown, then cloudy, then clear. A crowd cheered softly, not loud, not wild, just a long breath turned into sound. Children put their hands in the stream and cried because it was cold and real. The engineer stood back and let an apprentice open the second valve. The elder counselor filled a small cup and carried it to the wall of names and poured a little at the base and said, "Drink with us, all of you." Then he emptied the rest into his own mouth and coughed and laughed. The poet launched his paper boat in the basin and this time it sailed all the way across. The root seller washed his knife and said, "Now it tastes like rain for true." And in the barracks the young sergeant looked at the blue circle on his map and thought of the word remember. He added another word beside it, prepare. Night settled again, softer than before, and the stars looked less like spies and more like neighbors. The city slept in shifts and dreamed of ordinary mornings. But far away the enemy empire moved its pieces and drew new lines, and farther still, in a quiet place without flags, a small set of lights winked on as a listening post did its nightly test. The rope-scarred man looked at his board and nodded once. Routines are also armor, he said to no one. And somewhere deeper a different board carried a single note. The last SOS has been answered. The channel remains open. On the planet that had sent the cry, no one heard that note. They did not need to. They had work to do and a fountain to keep clear, and under the council hall the signal ring slept. Not dead, not forgotten. A song paused between verses, waiting, like the city, like the galaxy, for the next voice that would rise and shake the dark.